Good afternoon and warmly welcome to this webinar on trade unions, collective agreements and economic efficiency. My name is Daniel Lind and I work as a research director at the trade union-related think tank called Arenagruppen. And within Arenagruppen, I'm responsible for a 3-year project on productivity and labor markets financed by the 5 unions within Swedish industry. Our guests today are Alex Bryson, who is Professor of Quantitative Social Science at University College London, and also the Chief Editor of the Journal of, what is the name of it?
It's Industrial Relations.
Industrial Relations, sorry, I just forgot it. And then Harald Dale-Olsen, who is a research professor at the Institute of Social Research in Oslo, and also Agneta Berge, who is a PhD student in economics at Stockholm University, and is very interested in trade unions and collective agreements and how they shape the Swedish economy. Alex and Harald have devoted their working lives on labor market issues, employment relations, trade unions, firm performance, and well-being from different aspects. So they are very well known in this area and are leading experts. So we are very honored having you all three with us today. The setup for today will be the following. First, we will deviate from the standard procedure in the sense that I will give a short introduction with a purpose to create a framework for the viewers of what will be discussed later on by Alex, Harald, and Agneta. Second, Alex and Harald will give their presentation for 30 to 35 minutes. Then Agneta will comment on that, and then there will be a discussion among the three of them. And then, of course, we will take questions from the viewers. So please state your short and sharp questions on Facebook, and we will bring them up later on. All in all, we have 90 minutes at our disposal at most. So having said this, I now turn to my short introduction, and Agneta will help me to share the screen.
Unfortunately, I couldn't either.
You couldn't do it?
No.
Sorry for that. But what I would like to say is that when it comes to labor market issues and labor market research, we have seen an empirical revolution over the last 2 decades or so, with a lot of research devoted to understanding how the actual labor market works in practice and challenging earlier conventional wisdoms. And for example, researchers like David Card and others now are so well established that they now get the Nobel Prizes for this type of research. Also, we have this what you call poor performance when it comes to real wage growth and to the labor share in the economy in many countries, where the strong productivity growth has not translated into real wages and to falling wage shares in many countries. So that is 2 questions, two bullets to understand that there's been also a policy change, I would say, when it comes to, for example, OECD and their OECD job studies. They focus much more today on collective agreements, on trade unions, the importance of inclusiveness. 30 years ago, they were much more into reduced taxes, flexibility for the employers, and less security for the workers. So we have seen a policy change, I would say, based on this empirical revolution and new insights on how labor markets actually work. And complement to this, we have this monopsony research, which is a new research tradition that tries to understand how wages are set in firms. And the research shows that many times firms have the labor market power to set wages below the market clearing level. And in that sense, we have a policy discussion on how to push wages up closer to the market clearing level. And obviously unions and collective agreements are potential tools to do that. But having said all this, in Sweden, we don't have much of a research on this. Agneta is one of the few exceptions. So we're really keen to learn more and understand how to start this deeper empirical studies of the Swedish labor market. But given this current trend, I would say, researchers like Harald and Alex, they have been doing research for many years underneath this current trend on labor market issues, trade unions, and so forth. So we have a underlying theme of researchers also behind this new theme. So having said this, there's a growing research on trade unions and collective agreements. And now we have really brilliant foreign guests who will give us more introduction on this. Thank you.
Okay, Daniel, thank you very much indeed. And thanks for inviting Harald and I. It's a presentation by me and Harald. Harald from Institute for Social Research in Oslo and me from the University of London. And we've called it What Do Unions Do in Sweden? So roughly speaking, this is what we're going to cover. What do unions do? I'm going to talk about this from a theoretical perspective in the first place, but then we're going to quickly move to empirical work. A lot of the concerns about trades unions are that they appear to be in decline in many countries. Question, well, are they? And what might this mean for Sweden, and what's the evidence there? What we're going to show you is that unions do lots of things and continue to do so. And these things matter for both workers, firms, and society as a whole. But we're also going to draw your attention to many of the challenges that trades unions face, which means that they're continually having to reinvent themselves to make themselves relevant in the changing labour market. So let's briefly recap on what unions do, first of all. And of course, where would you start? Nowhere better than perhaps Richard Freeman and James Medoff, 1984, starting with the proposition that unions do largely two things. I'm going to mention a few more, but the first one was the monopoly face of trades unions, bargaining on behalf of trade union members or those covered by collective bargaining to push wages above the market set rate. And this, of course, might be good for both trades union members and those who are covered by trades unions in terms of higher wages, perhaps fairer wages, reductions in discrimination in wage determination, and reductions in wage inequality. But I'm going to argue that in many circumstances, unions produce not privately appropriable goods for union members, but public goods, because non-members often benefit. Non-members may be covered by trade unions' collective bargaining, for example, and benefit directly from their union wage setting. But even in the wholly non-union sector, the very threat of trades unions can result in employers raising their wages to the collectively set rate. Thus, even non-union sector workers can benefit from union wage setting. Of course, this departure from market set wages can have a number of knock-on effects, some good, perhaps some less so. And we're going to review some of those effects today, looking at things like productivity, profitability, employment, capital innovation, worker well-being, and so on. The other aspect of what unions do that Freeman and Medoff referred to was the voice effect, the extent to which unions can operate as representatives of workers in the workplace or at firm level, a mechanism for two-way communication between those workers who are represented by the union and their employer. You might think of this as an extension of citizenship rights into the workplace. It could be that firms benefit from this. How so? Well, in the classic voice exit model, if workers voice their discontent with the way things are at the workplace, it reduces their propensity to quit when they are dissatisfied. It's also possible through the aggregation of worker preferences that in a Williamson sort of way, unions can make the governance of the workplace more efficient. Of course, unions aren't the only voice mechanism out there. There can be direct forms of voice, things such as town hall meetings. There might be joint consultative committees, or in places like Germany, there might be statutorily set up works councils. So unions might be competing as one of many voice mechanisms. Of course, voice is central to the European Union's belief that social dialogue is fundamental to improvements in profitability and the performance of labour markets in the European Union. And you can see this in various pronouncements for the Commission, that voice is key to better governance, a driving force for economic and social reform, and a key component of democratic government and modernisation. There's another thing, though, that unions do. They provide insurance for workers against arbitrary employer behaviours. This can come in the form of enforcing existing statutory rights, such as equal pay. It can also come in the form of representation in disputes around unfair dismissal. Now, of course, unions do things beyond the workplace as well. They can be a force for democracy. They are, after all, democratically run voluntary organisations, and they look to promote democratic solutions to political problems. They've done so for very many years, and they continue to do so today. They also lobby on behalf of workers' rights in parliamentary settings, and they inhabit tripartite mechanisms where they give worker voice around the political table. And of course, in a subset of countries, and to some extent Sweden is one of them, the Ghent countries, they're hardwired into the unemployment insurance system and social welfare mechanisms such as pensions. Okay, so that's what they do. How are they actually performing? What's happening to unions? And many of us have heard about the possibility that unions are in decline. Well, first of all, you have to remember that there are a number of metrics that you might want to use when establishing just how many unions there are out there and how wide and deep they are. You might think in terms of bargaining coverage at national, sectoral, or local level. You might think of the way in which there's coordination across those levels of bargaining and centralization of bargaining. You might alternatively think of union density, the proportion of workers who are members of trades unions. You might also think of the financial health of trades unions, because after all, as the providers of the union good, one should be concerned about the supply of that good and thus the financial sustainability of trades unions. And of course, a lot of the time as economists, we're interested in looking at the role of unions in terms of their influence on other outcomes, the impact that unions have on wages, inequality, firm performance, innovation, and worker well-being. So are they in decline? Well, I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute from the OECD, and what you'll see is there is decline in the incidence of unionization in Europe and elsewhere on some metrics: density, bargaining coverage, the presence of trades unions at the workplace. But it's by no means uniform. It varies considerably across and within country. So one should be careful about extrapolating broadly about what's happening to trades unions. It varies by sector and occupation. And in terms of union membership, I'm going to show you it varies quite considerably by birth cohort. It's also true that even when unions are quite strongly present, as in France and collective bargaining, there are still questions about union legitimacy, the extent to which unions should be there to the degree that they are. Here's the English-speaking world, and this graph is simply showing in the last 20, 30, 40 years union density on the y-axis. That's the proportion of workers in union membership. And you can see in the middle there, the OECD average, and you can see gentle, substantial, perhaps to some degree, decline in union membership as a proportion of the workforce. You can also see big differences in levels. Look at the United States, where most of the literature is. You'll find that's where union density tends to be lowest. Let's look, though, more broadly using some great work done by the OECD and look at this middle panel here at the top end, and you can look at Sweden. Here's union density in Sweden, is the dotted grey-blue line here, and you can see it's fairly substantial. It was rising until the late 80s and has been in a little bit of decline since, but the levels are high. And actually in these Nordic and Ghent countries, by and large, in contrast to Eastern Europe or the English-speaking countries, union density has held up rather well. Let's look at a different metric, collective bargaining coverage. often only partially correlated with union density. Let's look again at Sweden here in the middle top panel. You can see very high bargaining coverage. That's because many workers who are covered by collective bargaining are not union members. That's the difference between the charts I've just shown you and these charts on this page. But Sweden is high, sure, but it's not the highest. Look at Austria, pretty much 100%. Look at France, just below 90% over here, down in the bottom left. And the trends do differ quite substantially across countries over time. And here's one of Harald's Norwegian colleagues doing a paper, very fine paper I've just drawn attention to here, just looking at Scandinavian countries grouped together are the green lines, union density on the left, collective bargaining on the right. Collective bargaining coverage is higher than density. Collective bargaining has been fairly stable for the last 40 years across these countries. Union density a little less so, and it's higher in most other countries. And that's important when we think about the evidence. Why? Because so much of the evidence until recently has been for the Anglo-speaking world, which is somewhat different. And here's the final chart on where unions are. This is from the European Companies Survey, and it looks at the incidence of worker union representatives at workplace level. The darker the color, the more workplace representation is by trades unions. And so you can see Sweden, Finland, Denmark, very high, as in Spain and France. You look at the UK, middling. You look at places like Greece and Portugal, really very, very low. So it depends where in the European Union you are, or where in the European space you are, as to whether or not you'd even have access to that worker voice in the workplace. What's the nature of the challenge then for trades unions? Well, we have the standard Manker-Olsen question about the problem of collective action. When unions are providers of public goods, it's rather difficult for them to incentivize workers to join unions when those benefits are available even for non-members. So you have this twin track problem, the first order problem of collective action around organizing workers, and the second is servicing them when they are organized. The problem, of course, is free riding, unless you can really sell private excludable goods, which has always been a big problem for trades unions. It didn't used to be such a problem because in many countries, it was legal to require workers to be union members through the closed shop. And that still exists in some countries. I'm doing work in Japan at the moment, for example, where that's still legal. But in many countries, such as the UK, that hasn't been enforceable since 1990. So what does that mean? It means workers have a real choice as to whether or not to join a trades union. And they're likely to do so based on some appreciation of the costs and benefits of doing so. And on the union side, things have also changed. The cost of supplying the union good is a rising function of the growth in the number of small workplaces we see in the economy. The costliness of the union good barely gets a look in, actually, in the literature, except we've done a few papers recently. First of all, we argue that unions arguably are amongst what Baumol will have called cost disease organizations, in the sense that given the very labor-intensive nature of providing union services, it's really rather difficult for trades unions to max out on productivity growth in what they do. As a consequence, the cost of union membership rises relative to other goods and services in the basket that most consumers have. So that's a problem. But then the state can come in, of course, as it did in Norway. State comes in and provides tax subsidies for union membership. And me and Harald have done a number of papers using those tax subsidies to explore the causal impact of trades unions in Norway on things like union profitability and performance. The personal cost of union joining, we show, is actually important because those tax subsidies have actually led to a smaller rate of decline in union density in Norway than would have been the case if tax subsidies had not been raised by the government in that country over the last 10 or 15 years. And we know more about the personal costs of union joining. We know a lot about it from the United States because of unfair labour practices by employers, but even in countries like France. My colleague Thomas Breda at Paris School of Economics has shown that those people who put their hands up to be a union representative in French workplaces actually take a career hit. What about the benefits of union membership? Remember, I mentioned them before: wages and other benefits above market set rates, the voice aspect, and the insurance aspect. Now, the wages aspect is, in a sense, quite easy to see. Oftentimes you see wages posted with jobs and you know whether they're union or not. But actually these other components, voice and insurance, are experiential. Workers know very little about them unless told by others about the real value to them as a worker. So this is the problem, that union membership is largely an experience good. What does that mean? Well, in a period of union decline, fewer and fewer family, friends, and relatives are able to explain the true total value of the union good. And as a consequence, we see a rise in never membership, the proportion of new cohorts who've never joined a trades union because they don't actually appreciate the full value of doing so. And this shows up in cohort effects, which I'm going to show you in a minute. There's another issue that unions face, of course: competition. Competition from the state, for example. How so? Well, through the extension of statutory rights at work. In the old days, in fact, one paper I have with John Forth is about this. In the old days, you relied on your trades unions to give you additional paid holiday. Today, there might be a European Union directive to do the same. So there's competition there. And there's also competition with employer-made potential substitutes for the union voice mechanism. Things like human resource management practices. At least in theory, they could substitute for the union good. Let's look at this union membership by birth cohort. This is the UK. Here we have, along the bottom here, age going up to the age of 64. And then we have union membership rates across the y-axis. And what are all these little lines? These are all birth cohorts. And what we find is that for every new cohort at any given age, the union density rate's been falling. So it's falling at every given age for all new cohorts of entrants. This is consistent with the problems associated with union membership as an experience good. Big question in the literature. Big question. We see a decline in union density. Does this mean that worker demand for unions has actually fallen? This requires careful consideration. In the literature, more often than not, you see people assuming that the decline in union density must be due to a decline in the demand for the union good. The argument often goes unions have had their day, collective problem solving in a world of increasingly individualistic, aspirational approach to the labour market is old-fashioned. We have competition from the state and from employers, as I've just intimated. But what's the evidence? Yes, the cohort effects above I just showed you on the last slide is suggestive of a decline in demand, but actually more direct evidence on demand for the union good indicates that what is actually happening, certainly in the United States and the United Kingdom, is a representation gap has grown up. Demand remains in place. The problem is on the union supply side. In fact, we see in a paper I've done with Morley Gunderson and Rafael Gomez in the United States, Canada, and the UK, even demand for the union good amongst the young has remained constant over time. Furthermore, there's virtually no evidence that human resource management practices and other employer-inspired voice mechanisms are substituting for unions, and demand persists. The problem, we've argued, the problems that happen at work that trigger the demand and the desire for unions remain the same as they ever were. But crucially, you've got to remember, when we talk about unions across countries, they actually differ one from the other fundamentally. Much of the literature has been preoccupied with the Anglo-US model. It's a membership-based organization requiring a fee for the service, often in a world with fragmented bargaining, with no national or sectoral bargaining, where there's plant by plant or firm by firm organizing. And that means a very high bar to entry to have a union in the first place. Let's contrast that with the case of France, for example, which has 6 to 8% union membership, but as I showed you earlier, 90% plus union coverage, with the extension of collectively bargained rates across the whole non-union sector. How so? Well, it's quite easy to trigger workplace union representation in the French system. There are questions about the credibility and legitimacy of trade unions in that case, but it's a fundamentally different union setting there. In Italy, we know, for example, that the majority of union members aren't even employees. They are retirees. Why? Because of the role that unions play in the pension system. And as I've already intimated, in the Ghent countries, we have unions hardwired into the welfare state. So huge heterogeneity across countries. Has employer demand for unions changed over time? And I always ask this question because actually unions can do a job for employers. How so? As an agent for the employer, lowering transaction costs, increasing long-term contracting, and that's the voice component, through information transition, that's the aggregation of worker preferences, and the provision of tacit knowledge from workers to the employer about the production process. They can take wage competition away. They can move through bargaining, take wages out of competition, focus things on competing on other margins of the production process. And they can allow employers to comply legally. They can explain what to the employer, how the employer needs to behave in order to comply with legal liabilities, health and safety, equality, and so on. The problem, though, is from an employer perspective, if you're facing a union across the table now and union density is falling, just how reliable is that union voice in representing workers here in my workplace or my firm? Maybe I will look to alternative voice mechanisms through human resource management practices. Maybe furthermore, I've decided I'm going to start competing directly on wages. And the last thing I want is set wages across the industry because I'm looking to push them downwards. So I'm looking for opportunities to lower wages. Perhaps unions are the last place I want to look. And of course, there are various reasons for that, such as increased sensitivity to the union hold-up problem in investing in capital, or actually paying above market wages if others have started to move to compete on wages. What do we know about evidence about employer demand for trades unions? Well, this isn't really a big focus of the literature. It's actually poorly understood, as I've been looking at the decline of sectoral bargaining. In Britain, it happened in the 70s and 80s. In Germany, it's been happening for the last 20 years. Do we know much as to why? Why is it that employers are leaving collective bargaining in Germany? We don't know very much at all. One possibility is that large firms are inhabiting that bargaining arena, raising wages, squeezing out the less productive firms. And Harald might have something to say about that in the Scandinavian context. What we do know is that employer collectives, that's employer associations and trade associations, continue to play a really important role in the labour market, not always in terms of collective bargaining, though, these days, but rather in terms of other activities, such as collusion to reduce labour market competition. Let's now turn to the effects of trades unions today. What do we actually know about the impact of unions on workers and firms? There are some big misconceptions out there. Oh, unions are in decline. Once upon a time, they really, really mattered for wages, inflation, strikes, productivity, even the political arena. Now unions are in decline. Maybe we don't need to care about them so much anymore, people who are not that interested in unions. But in fact, the tendency to write them off politically, economically, academically is a big mistake. Why? Because they continue to do stuff. There are many strong unions out there still. Collective bargaining coverage, as I've already shown you, is very, very high in many countries. And furthermore, the decline of trades unions also has very, very important consequences for workers and firms. So, furthermore, theory about the relationship between trades unions, the causal impact of trades unions on things like firm performance, productivity, and productivity is indeterminate a priori. That means we actually need empirical evidence. We need to study them, especially when the world is changing so dramatically and where trades unions are changing so dramatically. And what we see in this literature, broadly speaking, is that unions continue to have really, really big effects in reducing wage inequality, unfairness at work, have a pretty good track record in enforcing worker rights. They play big roles, and I'm going to show you how it's changing in terms of social welfare, including worker well-being. Worker well-being has always been a really puzzling one. If you look at job satisfaction, you often find a partial correlation between unionization and higher job dissatisfaction, but that's actually changed, as I'm going to tell you in a minute. Critically, always remember, and this is why it's important to have research for Sweden, for policy people in Sweden, unions differ one from the other, both within and across countries. And this is often ignored in the literature, which is dominated by the Anglo-Saxon world. Here's the evidence on wages. Let's take the United States, take the UK, the old literature. The union wage premium has remained roughly constant over time. The raw premium in the United States today is around 20%, falls regression adjusted to something like 10. We're doing more work on this because, in fact, people have been ignoring it for the last few years, and we are finding in the British case a substantial decline in the union wage premium. But the premium differs substantially across countries due to institutions. So I've taken a quote from a paper we wrote a few years ago, where the returns to union membership are much smaller or non-significant in a world where coverage is very, very high. Although that's even in the case of France, for example, there are returns to union membership. Bargaining strength really matters. So in a paper that Harald and I have just done with Erling for Norway, we show that union density, higher union density causally impacts wages and productivity in the firm. We also see unions continue to compress wages. This was true in the past, as Hank Faber's just shown with the QJE paper in the United States. But what unions actually do to your wages depends in part on where you are in the wage distribution and the size of the union premium for people like you in the pay distribution. It also depends upon centralization and coordination of bargaining. But by and large, we see wage compression, still very, very important result in terms of unionization for routine and non-routine workers in countries like Norway, which is also linked to the acceleration of technological innovation and growth in countries like Norway. We also see that unions continue to play a really, really important role in tackling inequality and sources of bad inequality, such as discrimination, and causally supporting low-wage workers, as we've seen in a very recent paper in Industrial Relations. And Erling Barth and colleagues have always argued that this role in terms of wage inequality is fundamental to the efficiency of the Scandinavian model of efficiency and productivity advancement. However, we must remember that the disappearance of unions is also very, very important. Christian Justman's done a paper for Germany, which shows the role of declining unionization in the growth of wage inequality. Quality in Germany, and Nicole Fortin and Thomas to pay lower wages. There are a bunch of other worker outcomes that we might want to draw attention to. Democracy and pluralism. We've shown in a few papers for Europe that unionized workers are more likely to vote in elections. We show that in the old days, unionization was linked to lower worker well-being, but this has switched. This has changed, not only in the US and the UK, but around the whole of Europe since around the Great Recession. That's a massive change in the empirical literature. We also find that unions reduce ethnic wage gaps, and they promote gender equality through things not only in the courts through class action, but through other mechanisms such as job evaluation. What about on employers? And this is what I think Daniel was alluding to at the outset. we see some really fundamental changes in the nature of the empirical literature. A lot of the old literature was about the UK and the United States, and it was replete with concerns about hold-up problems, the ability of trades unions to actually stop employers from improving productivity on the ground through job redesign, through the introduction of capital investment. What do we find these days? That's all changed around. Harald and I have done work for Britain and Norway, showing unions positively linked to product and process innovation. We even know some of the mechanisms. One of those mechanisms is a reduction in job-related anxiety associated with change when unions are involved in bargaining over the process of change. We also see, contrary to the old days, David Metcalfe's work for the UK saying that unions were strongly linked to what we used to call restrictive practices. That's the ability for the employer to ask you to do X, Y, and Z rather than A, B, and C. That's all changed. Instead, now we see positive correlations between unionization and the sorts of high-performance workplace practices that John Van Reen and Nick Bloom and others have talked about. But there are very disparate results on unions and productivity and profitability, both over time and across the world. How do we look at this best? We look at meta-analyses by people like Ducougliagos and Patrice Laroche. In the early literature, lots of negative effects. In the more recent literature, less so. And in fact, in the causal literature that Daniel was referring to, including the paper that Harald and I have written for Norway, we see very substantial positive effects of trades union density on productivity at the workplace. So perhaps an indication that unions are what Wolfgang Street used to call in the old days, unions as a beneficial constraint on employers. So why do these union effects persist when we think that the world has become much more competitive, much more global, larger pools of non-union labor? Well, actually, unions do target high profit sectors. They target those with high rents to share. Point number one. Point number two, unions often are very, very good at organizing those parts of the economy where there are now high wage workers, health professionals with high bargaining power. It's also true that the degree to which competition squeezes out opportunities for union organizing is really exaggerated. Many sectors with monopoly or oligopoly, or where the state still dominates, or there's strong regulation limiting competition, these are very fruitful zones for unions to organize. I'm not going to talk about unions in Sweden because I think Agneta's going to talk about that, but we can always come back to these slides here on the Scandinavian model and the literature there. So I'm going to skip through to implications for policy and the future. And there are some big questions here. Are unions welfare enhancing? That seems to me a first order question for society. Where do union wage gains come from? This really, really matters. Could it be that unions are actually forcing employers to pay workers above their marginal product? If they were doing that, then we'd expect plant closure, firm closure, substantial decline in employment. We don't see these things. Yeah, we do not see a literature where unions are strongly linked to plant closure and firm performance. It's true in some of the literature for the US and the UK, we see a lower rate of employment growth, but that's about it. Could it be then that what unions are doing are forcing employers to pay workers their marginal product in settings where the sorts of wage setting power that Daniel referred to at the outset is being challenged by trades unions? That seems to me a distinct possibility. It's also the case that unions are aware that some employers have surplus profits and others do not. And they go inhabit those firms, yeah? That's the sensible thing for unions to do. Identify where the rents are and then bargain over them. And so what often this wage premium is going to be linked to the surplus profits of employers. Of course, we're still left with the question of what is an optimal level of inequality in an economy. Perfect equality might not be deemed desirable. There are issues about incentives and so on. So this is always a question nagging at the back of our minds when we're doing this empirical work. But we do see also unions positive spillovers to other workers in the economy through extensions of collectively bargained conditions, through the union threat effect, and also because unions are very effective in pressurizing legislatures to take seriously issues like work-life balance, from which many workers benefit. So then what about the future of unions going forward? Is it going to be the case that there's a mutual gains scenario? I used that phrase. It comes from Tom Coken and Robert McKersey from the early 1980s in the United States. They often argued that unions are a good thing, not only for workers, but for employers. Is that really true? Could it be that unions are truly a beneficial constraint on employers? Employers won't necessarily feel it's like that at the moment when, for example, the National Health Service is facing strike action all the time in the UK, or the rail system is continually out of service. I'm sure the employers are not seeing the union as a beneficial constraint, but for us as researchers, that's one distinct possibility. What we do know is that we can look at employer actions and try to infer things about those actions. Why is it that there's been such a substantial demise of sectoral bargaining in Germany? That's a really interesting question. Is it employers voting with their feet? And we can look at case studies. Look at Volkswagen in Germany. Think of them as a blue chip company, strongly unionized. But if we look at Volkswagen in Chattanooga in the United States of America, in southern USA, a couple of years ago, the workers lost a big union recognition vote there. Why is Volkswagen in Chattanooga? Because it's largely non-union. Yeah? They're situated there in order to avoid trade unions. This raises lots of questions, such as whether or not there might be a race to the bottom in terms of global production. Can unions survive in a world where there's an ever-growing non-union sector? Well, maybe, because there are still very big firms, and of course they're increasingly dominating large parts of the economy, where big profits are to be shared. And that's where unions can make hay and do business. Equally, what is the taste for inequality out there? Post the Great Recession, post-COVID, what role can unions fashion for themselves there? And Daniel's spot on when he talked about wage stagnation. Unions as macro stabilizers, I've called it here. This is first order in a country like Japan, where I've been in the last 5 weeks talking to trades unions about trades union research. There's a lot of interest in government in the role that union bargaining can play to push wages up and move the economy along through increasing consumer demand for goods and services. Economies need growth, and perhaps unions can help. Of course, unions might look different in the future. They might not look like the old stable unions full of manual, semi-skilled workers that are largely male. That's not what the world looks like for unions in the future, and unions will be reinventing themselves. They'll continually have regard to how democratic, open, and transparent they are, and that might be why, in the last bullet point here, in politics, you ask yourself the question, who do you trust? Who delivers? And guess what? The literature shows trust in unions in Europe has been rising at a time when trust in many other institutions has been falling. And I used to say, and Harald and I always talk about this, could it be that the old tradition of unions being dominated by males who are old and stale is changing? Look at the United Kingdom, for example, where there is a new wave of female general secretaries leading the trades union movement. Harald and I did a paper where we realized that the median voter in the unionized world is now a woman, not a man anymore. Question, do unions deliver more for women than they do for men? Turned out in Norway, arguably yes. In the UK, less so. But things are changing. The other big thing that's changing, of course, is the costliness of union organizing. This was at the core of concerns about the supply side of the union good over many years. The concern that it was becoming increasingly costly for unions to be able to organize workers. But actually, they're starting to use technology now in a way that's actually limiting the costs of organizing, even in the gig economy. So that's something big and positive for the future. Okay, I'll stop there and hand over.
Thanks for this, Alex. Very informative and positive presentation. Before I leave the floor to Agneta, I just want to say two things. First is that yesterday our think tank released a major report on collective bargaining in Sweden and union density in different sectors. So this is a report written yearly by Professor Anders Kjellberg, who is this is the most extensive report we have in Sweden on the issues you talked about, Alex. And second, just to Harald, is there anything you would like to add or change or comment on?
No, not. I'm impressed by how Alex got through all those slides in just
very good.
minutes.
Yeah. Okay then, Agneta, the floor is yours.
Okay, perfect. So I'll share my slides there. Can you see them?
Perfect.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks a lot, Daniel, for the invitation, and thanks, Alex and Harald, for this extremely interesting presentation. I mean, I have about 10 minutes at my disposal. I could sit for hours to discuss this with you. It's really interesting, I think. So I've been given the privilege to provide a few comments on this presentation, and I'll focus mostly on what I think are interesting future research avenues in Sweden, but also in other countries. I won't talk so much about those figures that you skipped in your presentation, Alex, so we might want to go back to those later. So I'm Agneta Berge. I'm a PhD student in economics at the IIES at Stockholm University. And I'll be talking about three things. I have 3 slides, so I hope to keep track of time. All right, so I'll talk a bit about, very briefly, how I see kind of the status of the Swedish research on unions and collective bargaining. But yeah, very briefly, very shallow. And then I want to dive a bit more into what I see as interesting, promising avenues for future research and what I think really can be done. And then finally talk about what the key roadblock is to accelerating this research in Sweden. All right, so the status in Sweden, I would say that we have this older generation, this kind of late career researchers in economics. I mean, I'm talking mostly about economics here. And they were really, part of this kind of older union literature a couple of decades ago. Some of them have continued a bit doing research on this. But when their students were choosing their paths into research, I think really some of them were interested in unions. But at that time, kind of the general research interest died out a bit. Internationally, the US primarily. So these students didn't, devote themselves to unions and collective bargaining. So we didn't really get a new generation of union researchers in economics in Sweden. But I think now we have, a good conditions for having a new generation of early career researchers going into this topic. We are a couple already, like a few of us, not super many, but we hope to become more, who are very eager to revive this topic in Sweden, but also think about, internationally. And bring this research up to modern standards in Sweden in terms of the data used and the empirical methods used and theory and models used. And I think there's a lot of exciting work to be done. So I'm hopeful about that. So going into what I think are the avenues then for future research. I'll talk about 3 blocks if I make it through all of them. The first one is the firm side. So in general, I think it's kind of natural that the first things you look at are the worker outcomes as a result of unionization or different forms of collective bargaining. You look at wages, wage inequality, unemployment risk, or the probability of being employed, etc. And there is definitely some research on the firm side, but like you also alluded to or talked about, Alex, we know much less. about the firm outcomes and the firm side of this. And in a country like Sweden, it is really a partnership, right? It's two partners negotiating. So the firms are a very important aspect. And I think there are at least two parts to this, firm side research. One is just how firm outcomes vary with different wage setting systems and different unionization degrees. Like, so if you bargain locally or sectorally or nationally, if you bargain within one occupational group or several occupational groups, etc., and how strong the unionization is, and how that varies with firm outcomes, like firm size, productivity, their markups, their monopsony power, their capital intensity and investments, etc. I think there's a lot of still interesting things to be done, and this is really where like the Norwegian research is taking off right now, and it's fantastic, in particular for the unionization degree, because that's where you have exogenous variation, so it's easier to study. It would be very nice also to like study a bit more the actual wage setting and how that varies with firm outcomes. And the other part, I think, is like you also talked about, Alex, potential employer benefits from collective agreements. I think this side has really been, absent in the economics literature. In part because we have, like you said, Alex, really taken the US perspective. And I think in US, there is another firm culture. It's more like this, anti-union firm culture, where firms just don't want unionization. They don't want collective agreements. And in a country like Sweden, this is not necessarily the case. And there's actually a kind of small survey from 2017 asking firms about this in Sweden. And for the firms that have a collective agreement, the vast majority would still want it, even if the strike rights for the unions was limited. And they see benefits from having it. Among the options they were given in the survey, what comes out is like the relationship to the employees is improved and the firm reputation is improved. But you can think of many potential benefits theoretically, and that you could try to study empirically as well from how employers would benefit from collective. Another one is setting up trade or entry barriers, right, to reduce competitions from other firms. So if you have a collective agreement, then new entries of firms, they need to pay at least that wage, and then it's more difficult to enter the market potentially. So they could benefit in that sense. I mean, you can think of different benefits. And also, like, going back to the figures you showed on the declining unionization, but the high still collective bargaining coverage in Sweden, I also think that speaks to the importance of looking at the firm side, because the firms are really now, maintaining the collective bargaining coverage high and the unionization is declining. So we need to understand the firm side much better also for that reason. So I think there's a lot of interesting, both theoretical and empirical work to be done here. The second block, I would say, is to study more aggregate or equilibrium outcomes. And I come from a more also macroeconomic research perspective. So it's natural for me that I would think about this, I guess. But I see coordinated wage setting as, it's a huge price setting exercise. And we expect prices to affect firm behavior and outcomes. I mean, it's really at the core of economics. But we don't study collective wage bargaining in macroeconomics in a serious way. Like, we don't study the effects on macroeconomic outcomes, and we don't model it in a serious way. And I think this is a huge gap in the macroeconomic literature. But we just assume, like, there is some maybe new Keynesian models that have some union that sets a wage to get some stickiness, but it's not like a serious modeling. And there's a lot to be done here to really take this price setting exercise seriously. And I think it's an area for theory and models really to step in as well, because we don't have a lot of natural experiments to use to study this in data. So we would need to update models to more modern standards with the relevant frictions, the relevant heterogeneities, etc., and build us a framework that also helps us think through this very kind of complex problem of price setting on different levels, coordinating different types of workers and how it affects different outcomes for the firm. And in equilibrium in an economy, like how do other firms adjust? How do we allocate workers across sectors? There's a lot of interesting dynamics to think about there. So this is, I think, a very important avenue for future research. And I'm doing not great on time, so I'll be very brief on the last block, which I think is also just very basic. I think we need more, theory and descriptive research on simply, different bargaining systems. Like, how do we bargain in practice? Which workers bargain jointly, horizontally? And what is the effect of that? What is the effect of having different workers bargaining, and vertically? On what level do they bargain? And the content of the bargaining, what items are bargained over? What does that impact? Like, descriptive and theoretical research, I think, has a lot to do there. All right, so I'll skip to my last point. I think it's about time for that, which is the main the key roadblock in Sweden at the moment, and that's data and data availability. So Sweden, like Norway, has, we're famous for this really nice high quality registry data, which covers a wide range of great variables for firms and workers. But in Sweden, we have no information on collective bargaining agreements in this registry data. It exists, at some institution there or some insurance provider there might have something, but there's no systematic collection of this data. There's no connecting it to the registry data. And we have very little unionization data. So we did have, this tax deductibility in Sweden, but instead of the Norwegian government that just changes the level, here they impose it or just take it away, depending on the color of the government. So we have huge gaps in the time series, and we have a few years here and a few years there, and yeah. So you can study cross sections, but we don't have this, causal identification that you have in Norway. But so I think a key task going forward, and it's a joint task for the research community and the social partners, the unions and the employers, is to really systematically collect this data on firm and worker level regarding the collective bargaining agreements, which agreements are in place for which workers, and what is the content of these agreements. And worker level union membership data for more years would be fantastic. And then connect this to registry data and make it available for research purposes. I think if we could do that, that would really accelerate research on this in Sweden. I think a lot of young and mid-career, late-career researchers would be very interested in working with this. So yeah, that's my final word. And if you have any comments, Alex and Harald, on anything, or anyone in the audience, I'd be very happy to hear that. Thanks. I'll stop sharing as well.
Thank you, Agneta. Then I pass the question to Harald and Alex. What do you think about Agneta's presentation when you look about Sweden within this research community and the ideas she brought forward? What do you think?
I think she was spot on with respect to the data requirements. But you have to remember that even in Norway, we don't really know on what level bargaining is occurring on. We do know whether you have a trade union agreement indirectly by identifying who's available for early retirement. So it's sort of backward identification, but we do have these tax deductions that people have to supply to the tax authority, and that makes it possible to create long time series and do the stuff that we have been doing, and others as well. But it's clearly that these are important topics. The macro model should incorporate in some ways the way bargaining is occurring and how it occurs, because you do have quite strong theoretical implications from how, on what level the bargaining is occurring, on whether bargaining occurs. Yeah.
Alex?
Yeah, lots to say about that. So nobody's ever happy with the data they've got. Let's be honest. Even Harold's not happy, as you've just heard, and everybody else is jealous of Harold. But actually, what Harold does is quite special. We have the administrative data in Norway, and sometimes, you know, sometimes even 100%, and maybe longitudinal linked to employee data. That's the world that we all want to be in. But oftentimes, it's data from administrative sources coming from things like tax records, which don't necessarily contain the covariates or the treatments, whatever we think of them as economists, the unions, whether it be membership or bargaining, that we need to see. We might be lucky. If we see a tax subsidy, then the tax authorities may well have to say that person's a union member and that person isn't. So it ends up being that Harold needs to link those data to surveys that he designs. And he does it time and again. And there's a great research council in Norway that seems to fund Harold quite often in a serious competition with other colleagues who are interested in the same things. And because Statistics Norway is fantastic, as I suspect your own statistical agency is, they help him link these data, and oftentimes they provide him with sampling frames and so on. So you end up with very high quality data. Are there any other countries in the world quite like that? Well, there are a few. The Germans do very well in IAB, and they're linked to LIAB data, where they have workplace level data that they've been collecting since the early 1990s, and they link it to the social security system.
IDA in Denmark.
And Denmark, of course. But actually, this is France, fantastic. France, for lots of reasons, not only administrative data, but they have something that Harold has in Norway, and I used to have in the UK, workplace level survey data, very, very rich in covariates, with incredible detail about unionization, amongst other things, but also human resource management practices, you name it, linked to workers, including workers responding, telling you how they feel, which is where the worker well-being literature comes from. Now, and so I agree 100% with Agneta. This is a long-term project. You need serious investment on the part of researchers, but she's right, the incentives are there. Daniel said it at the outset. Economists are seeing the way labour markets operate in a fundamentally different way these days. They see monopsony, they see monopoly, they see serious departures from frictionless product and labour markets, and they want to know what unions can do in that sort of context. So that seems of first order. I think the incentives are there for students and academics now because, oh, I've looked in the QJE again. Oh, I see union papers. And they go, aha, well, and there's a reason for that. It's the reason that Daniel alluded to. So you have to spend time with your administrative authorities to get this data in order. And I should know because in our country, we don't have it really. But I am heavily involved with the Office for National Statistics and His Majesty's tax and HMRC Revenue and Customs, which hold the pay-as-you-earn tax records. And we are literally, this Thursday, we're having a big meeting where we're going to argue that we need those data as the framework in which to design the sorts of surveys that Agneta is talking about. So getting people on board is really, really important. But in the meantime, you can do something else. Because guess what? It's not true that you know nothing about unions in Sweden, because there's the European Social Survey, which has a brilliant variable in it, which I helped design, because it's not just current membership, but ex-membership and never membership, the three-way thing, really lovely. You have the European Company Survey, which is misnamed because it's about workplaces, but again, you have worker representation there. You have the ISSP data, the International Social Survey Program data. You have Eurobarometer. All of these things have trades unionism in them. Now, it's been traditional for economists to be very sniffy about these things. They think, oh, it's a I'm not going there. I mean, one exception is my longtime co-worker, Danny Blanchflower. If it's got numbers in it, we crunch it. And then we decide after the fact whether any of it makes any sense. And what's beautiful about those data is you can look at Sweden compared to other countries. Then you learn quite a lot. So there's something to be done in the short term with the data that's already out there. Some of it's beautiful. The European Social Survey, I think, is probably the best comparative social survey in the world. And it was designed in such a way to be truly comparable. And you have the opportunity to bid for revolving modules, or a new module. Somebody could do that perhaps on
Alex?
Yeah.
Could I add something? Another thing that you could do is actually utilize expert knowledge about changes to the bargaining process in Sweden. And through that derive causal identification and implications for inequality and other things. I seem to remember read a paper by Alexander Wilén, who's exploited changes in the bargaining system. I think Calmfors did something on nurses a couple of years ago, where you had changes in the pay schedule of these occupational groups. And that sort of provides information of what happens to these groups, at least. Of course, that it's fair to say that different unions might have different targets. So that's not necessarily that all unions have the same policy, the same dream, or the same. So that's fair to say. Okay. Just wanted to add that.
Can I a little bit change the direction here? But when Agneta talked about the firm side, and you talked about shortly, Alex, about what you have done together in terms of innovation and productivity. Can you just, for some more words, explain for the viewers what you have done when it comes to innovation, productivity, and creative destruction, so they understand what you have done?
Harald should lead on that.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I might take the lead on that. What we did in the productivity paper was that we utilized these changes to the tax deductions to see what happens to the union density at the firm level. The problem is that then you just run a simple regression, just looking at the correlations. You don't see the causal impact from union density on, for instance, productivity. So what we did was to see what happens to this union density measure at the firm level when you had this exogenous shock to the union density. And by utilizing this exogenous shock, the changes in the tax policy, which clearly wasn't related to the performance of the firms, we can see what was the causal impact from changing union density. And then we discovered that, this was positive, clearly positive. And not only was it positive, the impact was stronger on productivity than it was on wages. So not only did workers benefit from higher union density that we interpret as bargaining power, firms benefited equally and more, even so. So it was quite strong results. Although we couldn't pinpoint what was happening, it's very easy to believe that this increase in union density made these workers able to enforce some sort of a trade union agreement. Of course, in Sweden these days, Tesla versus Sweden is sort of making the headline news across the world. But it didn't appear that this is, in our case, it was a story about trade union agreements. It's more a story about all the other things that more unionized workplace brings with it. You get different arenas for meeting, different way of organizing the labor. So it was not specifically a trade union agreement thing.
But Harold, in the other work that we've done specifically on innovations in terms of process technology and products, we've done a number of what we call descriptive papers with survey data, and we've compared Norway and the UK with workplace level data. And what we show there is we go back to the old literature, and the seminal paper is Grout, I think about 1984, Economic Journal, the hold-up problem. Unions actually, although there's some theory around what could happen in a dynamic setup, but in a one-shot scenario, when the employer's looking to introduce innovations to improve productivity and profitability, the union's saying, well, hold on a moment, we want some of that money. And if we go into bargaining, we don't get it, you're not getting that innovation. And that was standard in the literature of the 80s. Most of the empirical literature indicated the hold-up problem was serious. But more recently, Harald and I have shown for Norway and the UK, it's switched around. In fact, unions are pro-productive in that sense. They are enhancing the propensity to innovate. We see that both in process and product innovation, even though in the theory it should be different, arguably. Harald was the theoretician, but my idea of it is the following. In a world where innovation could lead to the substitution of labor, then unions get worried and they might spend time trying to block that. But in a world such as a world where there's product innovation and there's the derived demand for labor rises, unions should be up for that. But actually, we find some fairly positive stuff on both fronts. And it shouldn't come as a surprise. I think recently, Daniel, you had John Van Reen and Nick Bloom presenting their whole literature on human resource management practices and management in the production function as a technology. Guess what? Unions are positively correlated with those things. Yeah. So
and what happened with the COVID? The same thing. Innovation. More likely to innovate with stronger unions.
And how do we know that? Because Harald invented a whole survey that he linked to the admin data in Norway, which was specifically targeted at employers to see whether or not, and if so, how they innovated during COVID.
Thanks. One question about when it comes to wages and innovation, I usually call it the Acemoglu effect, when the idea is that when you push up the wages, it becomes relatively cheaper to use more capital. So is it a substitution here, or is it different channels here? Do you have any ideas on that?
In our study, when we looked at the productivity, this was total factor productivity. So it was not just a question about capital.
Okay.
But,
But can you see that in firms with higher wage increases, is the technical change also faster? Have you seen that?
I seem to remember that the Svarstad and Kostad paper in labor economics sort of argue that. That's the level of technical innovations are stronger in these unionized firms.
Okay.
So yes, but I don't have that paper in front of me.
No. Agneta, do you have any ideas, comments, suggestions, and questions?
I mean, one just comment on that. I think what would be very interesting to add to this new Norwegian union literature, which I think is fantastic, is to connect it tighter to how wages are set. And maybe, like you said, Harald, you don't have perfect data on this. I mean, in Sweden, one can make kind of approximations based on occupation and sector and see what would be the wage setting system there, how local, how central is it. There's this categorization of collective agreements into different, into a scale of, from local to very centrally set wages. And because, I mean, yes, the kind of the local union presence does matter, but I think it, at least to a large extent, works through how wages are set. And So that I think would be like what I would really think is interesting to add to this literature.
Isn't that a big part of what Erling goes on about all the time, Harold?
Yes,
it is really, isn't it? The circumstances in which union set wages have fundamentally different implications in a highly coordinated world where everybody else ends up paying the union wage, as opposed to a world in which actually there's a whole bunch of employers who don't. And it does seem to me of first order importance in a world, for example, like Germany, unlike Norway and the UK, where employers can mix and match pay setting arrangements in any firm in the UK. They can have workplace level bargaining, firm level bargaining, and sectoral bargaining, or as more often the case in the UK, none of the above. In Germany, you choose. You cannot follow a sectoral agreement and have firm level bargaining. So when you see sectoral bargaining declining substantially in the German case, you need to pay attention and wonder why. And at the moment, we don't really know the answer to that. In Sweden, what's the Swedish system like in terms of, I've always seen in the OECD, fairly heavily coordinated, centralized. Yes. But what's the role?
But you do have a local element, don't you?
Yeah, first you have this central wage mark, which is applicable to all firms with collective agreements, and that is 80-90%. And after that, central wage is distributed locally, then you can negotiate locally above that, and how this central wage mark will be distributed within the groups.
It varies quite substantially. I mean, some collective agreements give you just a very small share that you can negotiate on locally. Some agreements give you the full, wage growth you can negotiate or distribute locally. So that really varies. But we do, like Norway, have this pattern bargaining, like small open economy, very export heavy economy. So the exporting sectors set the first pattern, and then that's like the aggregate wage growth or the labor cost growth for the whole economy, and then the actual outcome is quite close to that. It really is a strong one.
Yeah, but although of course when the local pot, the local sum available for bargaining is very small, it usually doesn't matter that much. No. But I looked at professors at university, because in Norway these professors, they have the way everybody gets a central wage increase, but they have to be members of the members of a union for the unions to demand wage increase for these professors. Otherwise, they are stuck on the same. And what you did see is that membership in the unions are crucial for whether these professors should get a wage increase. So I think, and I think that would be the same in Sweden as well, that how you bargaining local, in some cases you bargain for a fixed sum. Everybody gets, let's say, 1,000 Swedish crowns as a wage increase. Other unions bargaining for a percentage of the wage. You get a 5% wage increase. And that will differ between unions. What are the requirements? If you unionize white-collar workers, you go for percentage increase. If you have blue-collar workers, you focus on those earning little, and then demand in a fixed sum.
That's the same in Sweden. Actually, the National Mediation Office have 7 different models how to negotiate locally on this centralized number figure. But I wonder, your colleagues Magne Mogstad and Kalle Moen has written about fact and fantasies about wage bargaining.
Yeah.
And they argue that a combination of a centralized system but also allowing local differences could be a really good way to both set the aggregate and also adjust to local differences.
And that was the system that we sort of analyzed in the article, because we were looking at manufacturing, where you have a central element, and then you have the local bargaining taking into account the performance of the firm.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Because that's the idea in Sweden, to have this centralized, but also allowing local negotiations. But the wage drift locally is quite small, as Agneta said. So there's not much room to negotiate above the central wage mark, but you have different ways to negotiate within the wage mark.
Whereas, in fact, so this whole concept of wage drift and this relationship between centralized and local bargaining is of great significance and importance across different countries. I mean, so you see it in Portugal all the time, those discussions in the work of Pedro Martins.
Yes.
In the French case, it's fascinating because although you have very high collective bargaining coverage and you have a lot of sectoral bargaining, again, there is substantial space for local level bargaining. But in the French case, that's often because the centralized bargaining is so bad at delivering wage increases. Oftentimes it's below the SMIC, which is the minimum wage in France. Yeah. So there's actually quite a lot of room in that case for localized pay bargaining, which is why Thomas Breder in his Economic Journal paper shows there's a substantial workplace level wage premium in the French case. So it does vary a lot across countries, and even within country, across sectors and occupations.
Yes.
And within sectors as well. I mean, that's part of the idea with the centrally bargained wages. And that's kind of a complementary view to what you said at the beginning, Alex, when you said what the unions do. They set wages above the market rate. I mean, part of the task for the central coordination in Sweden is to practice wage restraint, to hold back wages at high productive firms. So when you set, one equal wage for one type of labor in a whole sector, it shouldn't, then you have maybe some room for local negotiations, but it should really be that the high productive firms get kind of a subsidy, a wage subsidy. Yes. So that you hold back wages. These wages are set lower than they maybe would have been in a decentralized system. And then at the low productive firms, you set the wages higher than their respective market rate, and then they are taxed out of the market.
Yeah. So one thing I think in that context, Agneta, Harald and I talk about a lot is how is a centralized pay determination arrangement reached at when you've got heterogeneous firms in the productivity space?
Mm-hmm.
And I've often thought that maybe this is what lies behind the disintegration of sectoral bargaining in parts of Germany. As you know, it's not really sectoral bargaining, it's sectoral regional bargaining. Mm. And many employers are leaving, even though they're leaving to a world where they still have to shadow the collectively bargained rate. Mm. And I think one reason might be that perhaps that compromise between lower and higher productivity firms in terms of setting the centralized rate has moved against the least productive firms. Now, in the Norwegian case, I've always had the sense when I talk to Harald and Erling that actually that's the point of the system.
Yes, it is.
In Sweden.
Yeah. Whereas in the German case, I'm thinking there's quite a lot of panic about this.
Yeah.
But I guess in Sweden, you do have some sort of technical calculation authority that sort of makes all the unions, different unions in different sectors agree on how is the economy looking at the moment. At least we do have that.
Yeah,
yes.
There is some aggregation. They do sit down and, there is kind of a clear formula for how they compute the labor cost growth. It's really value-added growth plus inflation target, unless, the wage growth in Germany is expected to be very low, because then you have to adjust a bit. But it's basically like either wage growth in Germany or value-added plus inflation target. That's how, from the union side, that's how they see the labor cost growth, and then it has to be distributed locally. But there is some tension in the Swedish system too, especially in the national sectors, the ones that don't export, that would want. They feel that they are kind of left behind or really held back too much by the system, and they want more wage increases. So there, I mean, it's not tension free here either, but precisely part of the idea is to tax out improductive, low productive firms.
And as you said,
Yes.
the most productive sectors, for example, the mining sector, the wage share is going down sharply for the last 15 years. So they're doing a lot of profits because they don't have to pay higher wages in that sense.
I mean, this is the other thing, Daniel, that in an ideal world where we were all seeing as researchers with our fully linked employee data, I'd like to know much more about the owners of the firm and shareholders. The sorts of things I normally only see in the pages of the Financial Times. I think following the money does mean that we need to know considerably more about the firm than perhaps we currently do a lot of the time. I mean, some people are, you know, Simon Yeager, for example, workers on the board, is shedding light on those sorts of things, but it's an area that labor economists, dare I say, often leave to finance economists. And so, and I think actually it's a really big part of labor.
I agree. But we are running out of time, actually. Are there any questions that we should ask just before we close? Alex, Agneta, and Harald?
Other than to say we'll send the slides, and Harald and I would be delighted to answer any questions about any of this from anybody if you email us.
Okay, thank you. Agneta, and you? Any final comment?
All union and employer side people out there listening should join forces in making this data available for research. And all politicians should reintroduce tax deductibility for union membership.
Yes, they should. Okay, thank you very much. It was very productive. Thank you. And now we close for today. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.